Hi all. This lecture is on chapter 17, Government and Politics. It's a shorter chapter, so hopefully I'll be able to get through this video in less time than it took me for the previous videos. But we're going to break it up into roughly 3 sections. So first I'll talk about what power is versus what authority is, just some vocabulary. We'll talk about types of authority. Next, I'll talk about different types of governments. And then finally, at the end, I'll talk a little bit about politics. I'll talk about money in politics and the kind of political polarization that we see now in the U.S. All right, so let's get started talking about power. So in order for there to be government, there has to be power. Some people have to be able to exercise power over citizens, right, in order to have government. But power is a broader term than authority. So power, I think Weber defines it as just the ability to exercise one's will over others. So very basically, that's what power is, the ability to exercise one's will over others, right? And if you go back to some early political philosophy or political theory from the Enlightenment, right, if you're talking about Hobbes and Locke and philosophers like that, there was this kind of idea that in a state where there's no governance at all, right, where you don't have a government, in a state of, sometimes it's called the state of nature, or in a state of absolute anarchy, right, when there are no formal offices or authorities, you have basically every individual, right, in competition with every other individual for resources and things, and every individual trying to exercise power or, impose their will on every other individual, right? And that can be absolute chaos, and we don't want that, right? Someone like Hobbes says in that state, human beings are so desperate, right, for some kind of governance, right, some system of control, and he had kind of a negative or pessimistic view about human nature. Hobbes thought we needed some sort of absolute sovereign, someone with complete control, right, in order to keep everybody in line by exercising their authority, right? We don't need to go that far, but we do need to have some kind of governance or authority, right? So authority we'll call a kind of legitimate power, or a power that people agree to follow, right? So we'll say legitimate, and I'll put that in quotes, because in some cases it's not that legitimate, but legitimate power, in other words, power that people, right, the citizens in a place, agree to follow, right? So also from that early kind of Enlightenment political philosophy or political theory, we get the idea of social contract theory, which means people need some form, some system of governance, right? They need something to some system of having legislation, some system of having enforcement of that legislation, right? Some system for protecting their rights, et cetera, right? So social contract is we enter into a social contract. We give up a certain amount of our liberty that we would have, say, in a state of nature or a state of absolute anarchy. We give up some of that to allow a government, some form or another, to have authority over us. So by accepting, right, agreeing to follow that authority through the social contract, we kind of make the authority legitimate. Now, this is also going to apply, for the authority of like dictators and stuff. And in that case, the social contract is not all that obvious. People are sort of being coerced or forced into agreeing to follow those leaders. But we'll talk about that later when I talk about types of government. Right now, I want to differentiate between three types of authority. So authority, three types. And the differentiation between these three types is basically based on why people agree to follow, right, this authority or this leader, or another way you could say it is what makes each type of authority legitimate, right? So why people accept the authority, why they agree to follow it, what makes each type legitimate. And like I said, there's three types. The first is traditional authority. Right? Traditional authority is authority that people agree to follow. So people agree to follow, or that people accept, or you could say that is made legitimate by, or because of long-standing custom. In other words, tradition, right? So people agree to follow it, they accept it, or you could say it's made legitimate by or because of long-standing custom. So made legitimate by long-standing custom. Kinds of traditional authority would be like a traditional monarchy system in which you have, royalty ruling people, and that those titles, right, are handed down through hereditary lines, and there's an assumption with those traditional monarchies of a kind of divine ordination or divine appointment of the monarchy by God or something like that. Or there was, when we had these sorts of traditional monarchies. So handed down through these hereditary lines and made legitimate for the people by long-standing custom. Basically, people accepted it or agreed to follow these leaders because of tradition. So that's the first type. The second type is charismatic authority. Charismatic authority. So this is the kind of authority that people agree to follow or accept, or we could say made legitimate by the fact that people are attracted to whatever the leader is, the leader's qualities or personality. In other words, the leader's charisma, right? That's why it's a charismatic authority. So people choose to follow this person, this leader, because those people are drawn to this leader's charisma, right? The leader has something, is able to rile people up. See, some examples would be like a leader of like a populist movement being able to take control of the government. A lot of these kinds of leaders emerge when there's upheaval in society or some huge problem in society that people are dealing with. These leaders are just as likely to be, tyrannical demagogues as they are to be heroes, right? So we have to be super careful about this kind of authority because it's very much attached to the person. It's very short-lived, and it's kind of dangerous too, depending on who the leader is, right? And a lot of leaders that want to have like absolute authority, try to create what's called a cult of personality. So Mao did this in China. Kim Jong Un and Il did this in North Korea. Hitler did this, right? You try to create a cult of personality so that the people are drawn to your charisma, or at least you want them to think they're drawn to your charisma, and you want to kind of make a situation in which the population worships the leader in a sense. So that is the second type of authority, why people agree to follow the leader. And the third type is arguably the best type, and that is rational legal authority, right? This is the kind of authority I was talking about when I talked about the social contract theory, right? This kind of authority is made legitimate by laws, right? Especially by a comprehensive constitution, right? So in a nation where you have, hopefully a democratic nation, right? In a nation where you have a comprehensive constitution that sets out the role of the government and citizens, etc., right? And talks about how legislation works and how the branches of government work and all that, right? You have a comprehensive constitution and you have laws. There is a social contract whereby people agree, right, to adhere to that constitution and follow that laws, even just because they're born into that place, in order for the rights, securities, and things that it ensures them, right? So that's the best kind of authority. And what's important about rational legal authority, as opposed to, say, charismatic authority or traditional authority, is that here the power or authority is attached to the offices, say, of the government, rather than people. Right? So you only have the power insofar as you occupy the office. And in a democratic society, you only have the power insofar as you occupy an office that you're democratically elected to, which is, the best possible way of having power or allowing people to have power over us, right? Power is not attached to offices. I mean, you could kind of say that with traditional authority like a monarch, but really it's attached to the person because it's handed down through hereditary lines, and that's specific to that person, right? And then under charismatic authority, it's clear that the power is attached to the individual because people agree to follow because of that particular individual's charisma or personality. So those are the three types of authority. And again, as always, that's all in the notes that I put up on Brightspace on Monday. All right, let's talk about the different types of government really quickly. And since I talked about traditional authority, as far as types of government, I'll start out by talking about traditional monarchies, not what we see today so much, but certainly, when most of the world, or the West at least, was under feudalism, this was a very popular type of governance, right? So a monarchy, right, is a form of government in which a single person rules until he or she either dies or abdicates the throne, right, to someone else, probably in that lineage. That's the kind of idea that we have of traditional monarchy. There's an absolute monarchy, right, which is kind of what we have in mind here, where the monarch has, total power over the population. Sorry, it says population, the military, etc. Right? So that's an absolute monarchy, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about, traditional monarchies for the most part. Now, switching gears to talk about monarchies today, most of the monarchies today, say for maybe the exception of maybe a couple Middle Eastern or African countries, most of the monarchies that we know today are constitutional monarchies. So a constitutional monarchy it's not really a monarchy, but it's a form of government in which the government and the population recognize monarchs but those monarchs are basically subject to the same constitution and laws as everyone else. So those monarchs are subject to the same laws as normal citizens, same laws as everyone else. So those monarchs are subject to the same laws, constitution, whatever, as everyone else. The obvious example of a constitutional monarchy is modern day United Kingdom, right, in which the population and the government recognize their monarchs, but they don't really have any real power as far as governance goes, right? They're kind of figureheads or not to be insulting, but they're kind of like the mascots, right, of the nation. And they're subject, again, to the same, parliamentary government and laws that everyone else in the nation is. So those are kinds of monarchies. A little bit different from a monarchy is an oligarchy. Now, in this case, you still have power that's relatively, or authority that's relatively concentrated in the society, but in this case, instead of being concentrated in the hands of like a single person, it's concentrated in a small group of people. So power is held by a small elite group, right, within that society. Typically a small elite group of people, I'll say of those who occupy the highest positions in the military or in industry, meaning in business, the economy within the nation, right? And this is, again, a very small group of very elite people who get to make the decisions, politically within the nation. The U.S. has certainly been accused of being a kind of oligarchy, and I'll talk about, how much influence money has in politics, and to a certain extent, we have a lot of lobbying, and so there's a lot of corporate influence on our elected representatives, but we are certainly not an oligarchy. A really good example of an oligarchy would be Russia, basically since the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's not been, I guess, a single oligarchy. It's kind of been a succession of different cabals, right? Some having, members from the last, powerful group, etc. But that's essentially how Russia is run. It's run as an oligarchy where those in the highest, the most elite, the highest levels of business and the military are making key political decisions for the rest of the country. So not far off from an oligarchy and similar to an absolute monarchy is a dictatorship. Like I said, dictatorship is similar to an absolute monarchy, but it doesn't necessarily involve traditional authority. And in other words, you can have a military coup and a dictator could take control that has no, traditional or customary role in the country, right? Or no hereditary claim or anything like that, right? So a dictatorship is typically unmitigated power held by a single person, right? Namely the dictator, obviously. And the most extreme version of a dictatorship is a totalitarian dictatorship, right, in which the dictator basically has control over most or all aspects of people's lives. So the most oppressive form, the dictator has control over most or all aspects of the citizens' lives, right? Of people's lives. And that could be everything from where people live to what people do for an occupation to how many children each family is allowed to have, etc., etc., to what religion they follow, on and on. Oftentimes under totalitarian dictatorships, citizens are forced to demonstrate loyalty to the leader. Totalitarian dictators definitely try to cultivate those cults of personality that I was talking about earlier to try to make the citizens worship them. But for the most part, the way that these kinds of dictatorships work is through fear, intimidation, and brutality. Because you have to think, you don't have a social contract anymore, right? Under a kind of government, that's democratic or characterized by rational legal authority, there's a constitution, there's laws protecting citizens' rights and things like that. There's a motivation and a reason for citizens to accept that power and see that authority as legitimate and beneficial to themselves. There's no motivation or reason for those citizens to feel that way in a totalitarian dictatorship that's highly oppressive. So what you have is you have to force the citizens to follow the dictator through violence, fear, intimidation. So, North Korea is probably the best example of this right now. Essentially, that dictatorship controls all aspects of people's lives. I've heard that people in North Korea have a radio, right, in their homes that is constantly playing government propaganda, and that they can turn it down, but they can't ever turn it off, right? There's in North Korea, there's systems of essentially ratting people out or tattling on people, so no community feels safe because they feel like there are informants everywhere. They have kinds of ways of punishing people by, instead of directly punishing, well, they do directly punish people for what they, see as any action or speaking against the government or whatever, but they also punish those people's families too, which creates even more fear and intimidation. So that's how those dictators are able to hold control over a population that doesn't necessarily find them acceptable. That, and again, trying to cultivate a cult of personality, kind of like Mao did in in communist China, historically speaking, to try to get people to want to follow. All right, so finally, the best form of government that human beings have been able to come up with is by far democracy, right? The best and most legitimate, as far as rational legal authority, form of government. So this is basically a form, or any form of government, that strives to give all citizens an equal voice in decision making, or you say policy, right, in legislation, whatever. Strives to give all citizens an equal voice in policy making, regardless of, basically, hopefully regardless of all social variables, or I'll just say regardless of socioeconomic status. But that should also be regardless of gender, regardless of race and ethnicity, etc., right? So, a form of government that strives to give all citizens an equal, say or voice in policy making, regardless of socioeconomic status. That is democracy. Democracies are best for ensuring liberty, right? But not only that, they function best when they ensure liberty, right? If you want to give everyone an equal voice and allow everyone to participate, then you're going to need to ensure things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right, etc., right? So you're going to need to ensure those liberties in order to have democracy, and when you have democracy, the situation is really good for ensuring those liberties, better than any other form of government. Just a little bit of differentiation here. You can have a pure democracy. I mean, it's difficult, but if you had a pure democracy, all citizens, right, each and every one, vote directly on all proposed legislation, right? So under a pure democracy, all citizens vote directly for all proposed legislation. We obviously don't have that. We have a representative democracy in which we elect representatives to vote on legislation for us, and we try to have some influence on them as far as how they do that. So we have elected legislators, right? Okay, so those were the types of government I wanted to talk about: monarchies, dictatorships, oligarchies, and then finally democracy. Okay, moving on to politics. Right. There's not too many notes you'll have to take down for my discussion of politics, but I just wanted to briefly talk about a couple of important issues as far as how politics work in our society. So I guess if we wanted to define politics, it would be something like the interaction between a government and its citizens, right? The interaction between a government and its citizens, or you could say the communication between a government and its citizens, is all sort of included in the idea of politics. What I want to talk about is, are two issues. One is the influence of money in this interaction, right? At least in the U.S. And the other is the polarization that we've seen happening politically for the last several decades or so. So first, it should be noted that in U.S. politics, in the interaction between us and our government, right, or with the interaction between basically anyone who's not a legislator, anyone who's not a government official, and those legislators, those government officials, money plays a really important role, right? So the U.S. houses a lot of very wealthy multinational corporations, right? That have billions and billions of dollars, and they use that money, right, in order to employ lobbyists in Washington, D.C., right? And those lobbyists, their job is to have influence over our legislators and try to influence them to vote in a certain way, right, for different legislation that benefits the corporations that they work for, right? So this is happening constantly. I think Walmart Corporation has at least 8 lobbyists that are employed just by Walmart, right? Living in D.C., having interactions with Congress people, and I think, there are, I think 12,000 or so lobbyists overall, right? So the U.S. politics is made up of special interest groups, and sometimes those special interest groups are more political in nature, like the ACLU or the NRA or something like that, or pro-life, pro-choice organizations. But a lot of the times, those special interest groups are corporate in nature or economic in nature, and so that's the influence that corporations have over our legislators through lobbying. The other way, right, that money has an influence, apart from corporations employing lobbyists or even nonprofits employing advocates and things like that in Washington, D.C., is corporate financing. So that's another way that money can influence how our legislators vote on legislation, right, and can influence policy overall. Running for office is really, really expensive. It can cost, easily over $1 billion to run, for instance, for presidential office, and it costs billions, for midterm elections and things like that. So there's a lot of money involved. In order to run for Congress or for president, you need to have a lot of money, right? And so that's gained through different political action committees, which are essentially special interest groups that raise money for candidates. And they also raise money just for particular policies that they want passed, or one political party or another, right? This is all kinds of things that these groups can raise money for. There are thousands of political action committees, and there has been legislation to try to curtail the influence that they can have through campaign financing. We had some legislation, for instance, in 2002, Congress passed campaign finance reform legislation that basically stopped these PACs, right, from raising a certain amount of money, or stop the PACs from collecting a certain amount of money for candidates. So they put a cap on how much they could collect. There's different ways of doing this. Like sometimes, each political action committee is maybe only allowed to give a certain amount to a candidate per election. But they can also do like fundraisers where they have individuals contribute directly to the candidate. That kind of gets around it. In any case, this was all kind of rendered moot in 2010, I think. Yeah, in 2010 there was a Supreme Court decision that basically ruled that the government can't really limit how much financial contributions can be given to a candidate, and this kind of made way for what's called super PACs. You might have heard of super PACs, which are these giant political action committees. And to make a long story short, essentially there's not much oversight. Basically, there aren't caps on how much they can raise for candidates and things like that. And it allows those special interests, right, to basically dominate American politics through campaign financing. Okay, so that's at least a little bit about the influence that money has on politics. Next, I wanted to talk just a little bit about polarization in the U.S. And I'm actually going to talk more about this in the lecture on media because it's pertinent to that too. But if you look at people's political affiliations and political beliefs, right, even specific opinions about specific opinions about specific political issues, right, we've seen over the past few decades people becoming increasingly polarized. So if I can find the link to this Pew Research, I'll post that. But essentially, we see that over time, since roughly the 1980s, 1990s, there's been a polarization such that people more often now, associate themselves with either one political party, conservatives, right, Republicans, or the other, liberal Democrats. And the gap between opinions is growing. So if you look, say 30, 40 years ago, obviously many people would, identify as exclusively Republican, and many people would identify as exclusively Democrat. But when we surveyed people or polled people about different issues, more often than not, people would say, I tend to vote, Republican, but I feel, more liberal about this issue or that issue. Or they would say, I tend to vote Democrat, but I feel more conservatively about this issue or that issue. That has become less and less the case. So we've seen opinions splitting and people towing party lines far more than they ever did. We have much less nuanced political beliefs and values, and we have a lot more polarized political beliefs and values happening. Why that's the case, there are many reasons, but I think part of that is the media, which I'll talk about in the media lecture. And the media has been, kind of talking about the culture wars and political polarization for even longer than it's been going on. So whether they just really predicted it very well or whether they helped cause it, I'll talk about in the next lecture. In any case, that's it for government and politics. Nice short lecture video, and I'll have Chapter 8 on media up soon as well.